isn't live because we don't have the satellites in orbit for that yet, but we will. And the other data that's coming in, though, the geological data, the meteorological data, and so on and so forth, that is live. So what you're getting at some level is a static view of the planet as it was photographed at some point, the geological view, which is gathered from terrain data, and this meteorological view, which is live. And I saw this, and something inside me simply snapped. I said, this was the vision that I'd had in 1990. This is the beginning of a type of thing that will be so commonplace that the globe that sits on every teacher's desk in every schoolroom in the world will be gone and replaced with this thing that will become conflated with our understanding of the planet. That in fact the planet is not this static ball that you can roll around that shows political divisions, because the first thing that goes away when you use a system like this is political division. There's no room for it in that model. What you see is the organic unity of the Gaian logos. And as time goes on, the better this model gets. The better this model gets, the more identified we become with it. Like the cell phone, it becomes a technology that we incorporate, so that one of the personalities that we can identify with will be the personality that is identical to this Gaian entity.
Don't you think it would be prudent to, instead of jumping directly to the Gaian logos, rather to see the Gaian anus, see the economic and resource flows?
Oh, I didn't mean to say that you'd only have one view. The idea behind any system like this is that it can show you all of the loops of human ecology and deep ecology, so that it's very possible to understand the correlations that take place between human effect on the planet and the result in the system. The idea behind it, in my eyes, is that if we can make these tangible, we can affect behavior, and in fact that's probably the only way we can affect behavior. We might recycle because we've been told over and again it's the right thing to do. It's been ingrained at that level. But when it becomes a tangible entity, the behavior change happens of itself, because it's part of you. It's become incorporated into your own understanding of how the world works. So I think that in fact this database, as I say, as it grows, needs to become as deep as possible, and because people will argue about the content of that database, it needs to become as wide as possible. And the web is the beginning of that, because you could have several different points of view. You could have the millennialist Christian point of view, which is to simply poison the planet because we're leaving anyway, and have that be one set of them, and we can sort of chart Amazonian deforestation and say, oh look, the number of days till the rapture, because that's how much rainforest is left.
Theoretically, you should be able to see anything you want to see to the exclusion of everything else. So if you wanted to see oil pipelines, electrical grids, the distribution of leukemia genes, the number of people bearing South African passports and where they were at any given moment, you should be able to, essentially it's a boil down of all the data,
When I sort of recognized that ability, I thought of it as a really great game idea, kind of a la the Sim series. It's Sim Gaia, but it would not be simulated, really. You could have every participant in the web utilizing all the resources of the whole planet to focus on any particular area they were interested in healing, and make sort of suggestions to large corporations how to distribute their
in which case
resources.
It starts to harness the power of the web. We really haven't talked about this as an intelligence amplifier, which it can in theory do, and that's one of the biggest parts of it. In fact, one of the reasons things do move faster now is because there's this common sort of, it's almost like a hummus of knowledge. It's this layer of knowledge that we can all refer to. It's not all true, but it is all in common.
I want to say something about what you were talking about, multiple personality and all that. I hadn't quite thought of it that way. One of the puzzles of the DMT flash is that there are these entities that seem weird, very strange and machine-like and alien, but that are also permeated by a kind of eerie familiarity, like you remember them from somewhere, or it's this thing. And it's occurred to me in trying to propagate all possible explanations of what these things might be, that they are, as Mark said, the self is not ruled by the ego. The self is actually a kind of elfin swarm of these, and this peculiar elf quality, which I've described as elf machine-like and somehow based on language, is that these things are, and don't ask me to explain too deeply what this means, they are fractal refractions of one's own personality. I've mentioned at times the metaphor of if you hold up a mirror, you see yourself. But if you bring the mirror down sharply on a concrete surface so that it shatters, you don't see a shattered image of yourself. You see hundreds of perfect images of yourself, one in each shard, little ones, big ones. And in a sense, DMT is like some kind of an X-ray of the psyche, revealing this fact concealed by the ego-based, print-created, subjectivist, positivist plot. The fact that you are not who you thought you were, that you are not an ego bound to a body, but that in fact that is some hideous convention that culture and phonetic alphabet and all these things have forced upon you. And so then, in thinking about this new kind of personality that's coming to be, or how will one live with this sense of fracturing and all that, you said it was almost as though everybody was coming out of the closet. The image that formed for me is, it's like realizing and embracing the fact that you're an actor.
Right.
I grapple with this all the time because when I'm brushing my teeth, I find myself humming, "There's no business like show business. There's no people like show people." And I've, started out thinking that I was a philosopher, and the way I live in Hawaii is so entirely different from how I am on what I think of as the job, that I have just had to accept that I'm this very strange person and have peculiarly defined relationships with almost every single person that I deal with. And I have a feeling that the modern cult of celebrity and this fascination with vicariously living through the most recent spate of mass murderers, presidential assistants, movie stars, so forth and so on, is a kind of practice. Ordinary people are practicing to be actors, to have this same
to be
kind
extraordinary,
to be mutable, and it seems inevitable. It's modeled for us in the media so persuasively that we can't help but become characters. That's what's happening to us. We're becoming characters, many characters. Yeah.
Now, is this a desirable thing? I can't even intonations.
Is it a positive thing?
Yeah, I mean, you have kids in Chicago who,
Well, that's not a positive thing. Please don't frighten me.
Violence somewhere, maybe from TV or movies, and murdered this little girl for a bicycle, and 2 hours later be home watching cartoons and having popcorn. So is it a good thing to have the little kid persona and the murderer persona and all these things so we can come out and enact whatever we want to be?
There are.
You answer, then I'll answer. No, you answer, then I'll answer.
There are, I think, in any situation where there's a disassociation like that, my own understanding is that there are attractors for behavior. And some of those attractors are pathological. And so if a personality coheres around this pathological attractors, you're going to get pathological behavior. It won't be consistent. That's why the kids can go home and watch TV afterward, because they're really, I think, in some sense disassociated from those parts of their being that produce that type of behavior. So what would be called for in a situation, if we're going to accept disassociation as a condition of modernity, then the idea would be to, in the reverse sense, build as many what I would call vivigenic attractors, present as many opportunities for cohesion around the personality in a positive logos. And I mean, again, that brings us back to the body. And if I can just ramble for one more minute.
Going. Fine.
Which led me into the concept of techno-paganism, for lack of a better word, and that's a placeholder, which is a positive response to this type of fracture, that I can, through ritual practice, through magical practice, build areas in myself that allow for that positive cohering of the personality, which doesn't have to be any single one personality, but can be a range of God forms. Because paganism is a study of the archaic God forms, which can represent the archetypal elements of my psyche, so that I can bring them forth in a particular situation or toward a particular task. So that I could, do Pan if I'm going to be in a sexual mode. I can do Hermes or Mercury if I'm going to be in either communication mode or I want to trick someone. Okay, I can do Cernunnos if I want to sort of be, the very sort of primal male, or I can be the mother if I want to be very nurturing, so that all these primal God forms can act as loci for accretion of a personality around a particular point. And my magical practice has been much that for me, as a point of stability in there.
I'd like to draw it just back to Terence's inference that, or what I took from it was that, we were in the tub last night and with Terry's kids, and I was grilling Terry's kids about this whole 2012 and how much novelty can there be, and it seemed that at the point of maximum novelty, my suggestion was, well, does that means essentially that it's one big Burning Man, no spectators, so that everybody in Utah is now like putting out their own electronic CDs and stuff, and making their own videos. Somebody bounced that back to the web, of course. The web pages are like that. There's these grandmas in Utah, and there's these crazy, unbelievable expressions of creativity from your sort of average person. So, is that maybe what that level of novelty would be moving towards? Is it the Truman Show, or waiting for Guffman, essentially?
No, I think we're probably close to that now.
Yeah.
What with See You, See Me, and people who sell the fact that they exist on the internet through 24-hour cam.
MyFirstTime.com.
Yes, exactly. But this issue that you raise, we are on one level carnivorous monkeys, and part of what people have to realize, I think, is that culture is not your friend. What techno-paganism means to me is arming yourself as a warrior to survive the onslaught of all the magic spells that are being flung around in your environment. And so, what Mark said about, we keep coming back to this thing about every piece of information that comes through you affects you. Certainly Esalen is a place where very strongly now for many years the idea has been in place that there was such a thing as healing images, that people by imaging states of health or the shrinking of tumors and so forth could actually affect their own state of being. What hasn't been looked at with sufficient attention is the concomitant to that, which is, if there are healing images, then there are polluting images, damaging images, images which make being a human being a more difficult proposition. And we have been very loath to examine this because we are very deeply committed as a culture to the idea of freedom of expression. But the doctrines of freedom of expression and universal education and so forth that we're so fond of were formulated before the rise of modern mass psychology, marketing theory, the Joseph Goebbels contribution to the situation.
That's right.
And I think people are responsible for their mental health. To assume that you are born mentally healthy and will tend to stay that way is preposterous. All kinds of forces are trying to turn you into a compulsive, an obsessive, a sexual psychopath, a wannabe this, many forms of intellectual pollution abound. And people who endlessly imbibe mass media are at high risk for pathology. And when I hear about these things that go on, not particularly this one you mentioned, but the ones where kids go to schools and blow other kids away somewhere in the South, and then immediately what the media portrays is a week of church suppers and mass mourning where everyone asks, how could this happen? Well, church suppers are what drive people.
Yeah. One of the things that I think that's really important to remember, one of the kind of like pathological edges of our cutting edges of our time, is that as we move into this era of connectivity and massive amounts of information at our fingertips, and the fact that these 6-year-olds are going to grow up never knowing anything else but having that capability, the adults who are raising them do not come from that world. And how can you possibly imagine raising a child to live in a world that you've never even touched, that you will be nothing but a little footnote in? So it's a very, very dangerous time. Children who are 6 to 10 years old today are going to live their lives in the 21st century, and they're going to have to pick their way into what the 21st century, the third millennium, is like on their own. It's not going to be easy. It's not always going to be pretty. And it's tough. It's hard. It's really hard to own that. But I think personally, I think that's part of growing out of the human condition into godhood, of taking responsibility and saying we're gonna move into something new, and it's gonna be hard.
Perhaps, though, what we can do to riff off of, and I think you're dead on when you say we have to arm ourselves against the magic spells. Perhaps what we can do is to try to give them a locus of at least one personality which has the filters. It's as if we need to develop an informational immune system because the viruses are out there and they will infect you. And it's as if we need that second order unity, and we need to be able to try to develop it and teach it to our children at the same time they're acquiring language, which is the device by which they acquire viruses, at least right now, so that they have some protection. That we need to be the white blood cells and the T cells, or we need to give this to them, because otherwise they will find themselves overrun, particularly when they're young enough not to be able to discriminate.
That's a beautiful vision, but how do we go from where we are now to coming into that awareness on the mass level?
Well, I mean, on one level, all I hear Mark saying is we've lost touch with the ability to tell shit from Shinola. Saying we must arm our children against the magic spells, to me that means we must teach them to avoid cult and hype and the non sequitur and the over-financed glitzy image. And the way to do this is, you start with, it's easy, like Occam's razor is a good place to start, and cost benefit is another interesting filter too. And who does this help is a good question to ask, and who does it hurt? And the problem is that people have become very docile, narcoticized. I mean, intellectuals seem to have the wild gene, and so we continue to hold meetings and bitch about it. Lots of people have just moved into daytime TV and Olestra and the rest of it, and without a thought.
But that being so, the we who must do that is the mass culture. So it's like, how does the we that you're referring to of what we must do come into being in effect?
Okay. One thing that I believe is you attack magic with magic. And I think that's really the only effective level you can do it on. Now, one of my foundational assumptions, which we talked about last night, that in fact the magical description of reality is in fact conflating with the actual description of reality. So that in fact magical training, I think, is going to be a cottage growth industry over the next 20 years. And I'm not being flippant to say that I actually do believe this, that in fact in order to be able to understand how the language you use and the language other uses shapes your perception, and that's more than just really advertising, it's much deeper than that, is an important social skill. And that's the level where it enters culture. Okay? Can we do it? I think we have to do it in every one of the works that we create. The works that we create have to be conscious of it and have to accept it. It works in, if I can just go off on another little riff.
Can I just jump in for 1 second?
Yeah.
I want to say that the kids are all right. You know what I mean? They're often much savvier media consumers than their parents, and then even people that are a little older. I mean, these kids have tremendous filters. Like, they can tell shit from shining all over.
So are they growing up with the immune systems? I mean, is this something that's maybe just happening now because of the environment?
They are naturally attracted to quality stuff, to intelligent stuff,
to the authentic.
Yeah, to the authentic, right. That's, keeping it real is the buzzword. That's what they want to do.
That's very encouraging to hear.
Yeah.
It might also be as they grew up constantly switching perspectives and forums.
Right.
And that's the trick, is to learn to be able to see it from the outside. As soon as you can see it from the outside and know what's happening, you can stop it. It's being stuck inside and you don't see it.
Yeah, they're
so these kids grew up changing perspectives all
Right.
the time. They're more immune naturally.
Yes, I don't think that kids are the problem. I think the problem is the momentum from the older generation that is still trying to hang on to the levers of the engineering and design process.
Right.
And they don't know why they're hanging on, because it doesn't serve them. The future is inevitable. You can postpone it a decade or two, but that's about it.
Well, it's because they're risk averse. They don't want to let go because they're afraid of what they don't know is there. And it's like hanging on to any losing position. Ultimately, it's going to change, and they're going to have to let go. But in the meantime, they don't know how to.
Well, Max Planck said physics proceeds funeral by funeral.
There's a beautiful anti-spell to that notion, which I think probably has to be circulated in culture as a bit of a meme, which is, it's not what you don't know that'll hurt you, it's what you know that ain't so. That ain't so. It's Marlon. And in some cases, we have to get over the fear of not knowing what the future is, because what we know, or what we think we know about the present, ain't so.
If you go back and look at various people's efforts to triangulate the future, the very best people got it wrong. I mean, if you look at the history of efforts in the 20th century to predict the future, probably the most successful was Brave New World, which in 1937 pictured a very realistic world based on genetic engineering that is still further out than anything we've arrived at and still could be realized. I mean, he understood the hellish marriage made by marketing, genetic engineering, the wish for social standardization. There's barely a mention of computers in that or in 1984. Well, in 1984, the telescreen was a surveillance system.
Clark got those right.
Yeah.
There's a grappling with chaos going on between Rushkoff's Children of Chaos sort of scenario, like that those kids are, perceiving a discontinuous reality through the media, and that they're actually maybe quite more adept and think at deciphering or siphoning off what they need from it, but also the Kate, I'm sorry, I lost my thought. It was just from the last thing you said about chaos. You didn't say.
Oh, well, I didn't mention chaos and can never recall the last thing I said. So you have my sympathy, but not my help.
No, I'm sorry, I got it. It's really more about the visionaries and the Brave New Worlds, or what we got out of the influence of computer culture on science fiction, which was cyberpunk, but which was still really steeped in chaos as its premise. I mean, really, what makes those, what made cyberpunk different than, Clark's foundationism or any of this sort of Star Trek approach was
it's chaos.
The element of chaos. Chaos. That it's a completely chaotic cyber universe.
Right, and in part that's because of the incredible information flow that has really just made everything diffuse in some way and not non-linear.
And it's very multiplistic. It accepts that there are going to be all kinds of social ecosystems and people working different angles. The street finds its own uses for things.
So I want to ask a question, which needs to be asked for two reasons. This multiplicity, which is both the present and probably in the future a more prominent condition, is this a frightening condition? Is it frightening when you look at it as an individual and you say, this is happening to me or happening to my children? And is it frightening when you consider everything as a whole? And the reason I ask this, and does it have a sort of demonic aspect to it, in the sense of really sort of looking dark? The reason I ask this is because the cultural historian William Irwin Thompson has noted that repeatedly when there's a transition of age in civilizations, that in fact the forms of the new civilization are always perceived as demonic by the civilization that's fading away in face of it. All right, so that when we look at this, I look at, and it's funny, just a brief little story. Last week, after years of wearing glasses, I finally got contacts again, and I decided I didn't want to smoke when I was at Esalen. I've been doing it a little bit, so I put a derm patch on. And I looked at myself in the mirror and said, damn, I've become a cyborg. I've become a character out of a Gibson novel. And I look at this, and the things that make me the most nervous about the future are the changing role of genetics. That genetics is, as we come to understand the code, as we come to see the pattern in the code, that our relationship to that code changes, and that code becomes very mutable, and that scares the bejesus out of me. And I'm wondering, as I sit here and I look at it, as that information flow works its way through the cell. Now, not because of nature's God, but because of us and our will and our destiny, our teleology. That's frightening the daylights out of me. And I'm looking at this and I'm saying, well, does that mean that this is then the future and I'm an artifact of the past?
Yeah, the cybernetic revolution is in all of our faces because we all surf the net and experience it daily as a growing and changing environment. This genetic thing goes on somewhat in the background, but if something happens to you, then you go to Stanford Medical Center and then you discover what they've been up to and what's on the menu for you, you know. And we were discussing last week, you know, they're now defining the human genome, and they're defining the 200,000 or so SNP points where there is variability in the genome, and that's where the hereditary diseases happen, so forth and so on. And it is within the reasonably short-term future, all these genes are going to be items for sale, pieces of nanomolecular machinery off the shelf that will make the difference between whether you die of leukemia, remain obese, become schizophrenic, experience liver failure, so forth and so on. And this will be simply in the pursuit of equilibrium, health, and peace of mind. Once people begin to look at genes as drugs, the boundaries between self and world and identity and one's genetic heritage will be erased. I mean, the very notion of a heritage and a coherent genealogical tree begins to make no sense if you're swapping out genes that you buy down at the A&P.
Gattaca, absolutely.
Molecular biology and molecular genetics and molecular pharmacology are really just different labels on the same door. All of these people are manipulating atomic systems, atom by atom, molecule by molecule, to tailor-make lock and fit mechanisms that impact on biological systems first of all. I mean, long before we grow a telephone from a long chain polymer, we will be selling human genes with no thought at all about it. I'm sure of that. You wanted to say?
Yeah, I was going to say that just a couple of steps past selling the genes, you get to the point where you have the nanomolecular assemblers where you can simply define, self-design, not just mentally, not just self-design your software, but your actual add on some diamond to the meat. You know, right. I want some diamond wings.
Right.
And this is diamond wings may be a bit downstream, but all of this is arriving in the next 10 to 15 years. Right. I mean, this is well within reach. And it's always about cost-benefit curves. I mean, almost anything can be done in genetics now if you're willing to spend tens of millions of dollars. But these, you know, recalling that the world's largest computers cost billions of dollars in 1950 and couldn't do what today's desktop does, you see that the distance in terms of compression cycles of research is very short.
So is this preferable to the Bullworth solution for our genetic future, where we all fuck each other till we're the same color?
Well, that's happening.
This genetic revolution that we're on the cusp of hasn't arrived yet.
Wow.
No, it's arriving. It will arrive gene by gene.
If you're diabetic, it's already arrived because you've been using human insulin for 15 years.
Sure, but the things that we're talking about haven't really gotten here in full force, and that's probably a huge revolution surely a huge revolution into itself.
Right.
In between now and then, the fear of extinction, the fear of being part of what made this planet the way it is, according to Darwin, is part of what's driving us all, and it's probably part of what's driving this phenomenon you're describing.
You mean of some huge catastrophe?
Well, we're all here because we're, lucky because we were the chosen sperm. We're all here because we didn't die along the way. It's a remarkable phenomenon that as many people live as they do. And when you look at all of this in combination with the way that consciousness is going, it suggests that there's something there, that we all realize that on some very deep level.
You mean that there's an attractor for the historical process in
Yes.
some sense? Yeah, I can feel it.
And again, it seems to be that the common fabric is the understanding of pattern and the flow of information. That as the understanding of pattern and the flow of information passes through every one of these structures, as it passes through the structure of materials, we get nanotechnology. As it passes through the structures of knowledge, we get virtual reality. As it passes through the structure of the cell, we get genetic engineering. So there's a common river, in a sense, that's running through all of this.
Yeah, I, in my most high-flown moments, think of us not as causing this, or this, but that the laws of physics themselves are becoming more permissive, that the emergence of biology was a consequence of certain temperature and pressure and chemical regimens coming into existence that had never existed before. And then once those regimes were established, biology was an inevitable follow-through. And I think what we have established uniquely on this planet is a domain of epigenetic information flow. Information that is not coded into genes, but that is coded into much more ephemeral, culturally created language systems, and that this epigenetic language domain is somehow much more mutable than the genetic language domain. And so potential emergent properties appear in the epigenetic domain with greater speed and frequency. They also have a kind of autocatalytic or synergistic effect on each other. So the phonetic alphabet makes possible science, which makes possible a new industrialism, which feeds back through R&D into science, and you get and it's that information is more and more expressing its true nature and less dependent on the medium through which it flows, which was once geological processes, then genes, now once human languages, now computer languages being iterated at tremendous speed, and where this leads we cannot say, but where it points we can say. It points toward transcendence.
Well, that's the 100th monkey syndrome. The third monkey syndrome, I've heard it explained two ways to me. Knowledge creates knowledge and creates self.
But the important thing is that there is an asymptotic acceleration. It's not simply a ramp into novelty. It's an ascendant curve which has now become almost vertical. Yeah, Mark.
It seems that something that I've been thinking about for a number of years, which brings us back into boundaries. From what we understand about the beginnings of life on Earth, it formed at the most important boundary that we know of on Earth at that time, which was the boundary between the land and the sea. Then, in fact, the stasis of the land and the stasis of the oceans were both insufficient conditions for the creation of self-organizing systems. That, in fact, the tidal pool represents the locus, the change, the dynamism, the fact that forces, perhaps self-replicating clays, we don't know, were constantly washed and then dried and then washed, forced these systems into some sort of self-organizing principles which became the template for what we know of as life. And this has then been repeated because then we talk about the epigenetic transmission of information. And this then, as we've talked about earlier in this session, is the boundary between one person and another person. That in fact it's the information when it crosses the boundary, to transverse the boundary, is to produce something different in both sides of that boundary.
Yeah, I never thought of that before, but in a prebiotic planet, from the point of view of novelty theory, the most action happening on the planet would be the intertidal zone, because every 12 hours it's being inundated and dried, inundated and dried. I mean, it's not exactly a party. It reminds me of the joke in my town. There was so little to do that on Saturday night we used to go down to Ben Franklin's and watch them uncrate freight. But when that's the only game in town, that's where you go, right? So the intertidal zone 800 million years ago was definitely where the action was on this planet, and today where the action is where all this science, money, human ingenuity, capitalistic frenzy all comes together in just an orgy of epigenetic effects.
Do you think the origin has any bearing on the outcome? I mean, for instance, does it make any difference whether it was intertidal zones and self-organizing systems, or whether it was panspermia coming from God knows where? Does that make any difference for the outcome?
I wouldn't think so. I think probably all paths lead to Rome. I would bet you that even if panspermia is true, that the intertidal zone of the primitive Earth played a role in it, because that's where the energy and the free radicals and so forth would have been available.
That's where they were uncarting the freight.
Yeah, right.
Isn't that just a further barrier between the atmosphere and the space?
Yeah, it's the three coming together.
Yeah, it's where the three are intersecting with the biology and with the geology and with the terrestrial chemistry possible in the atmosphere and the hydrochemistry possible in the sea, and incipient meteorological contributions, incidental hard radiation from outer space, radioactive heat from the internal processes of the Earth, on and on and on. As when you raise the number of inputting factors, you raise the possibility of an emergent phenomenon.
Which makes the interesting points, and I'll come to you in just a second, which makes the interesting points, the liminal points, the points where the roads meet. Those are always the places where the action is.
Right.
And so if you look in the present culture, where are the roads meeting? Well, the net is, that's it. Everything points into it now. That's where all the roads are meeting. So it's now throwing out this profusion of novelty and of new forms, because it exists as an object specifically to do that. Yes. Although the current theory is that as things get faster and faster, the danger is not car crashes but parking accidents.
Of course.
You've mentioned a lot acting with heart in all of our actions and on the net and that sort of thing. And I wanted to ask Terence which entheogens, organic psychedelics, are best at opening the heart, stimulating the heart center.
Well, somebody else might give a different answer, certainly, but I think ayahuasca, if I understand opening the heart to mean what I think it means, psilocybin blows your mind, and if you like insects driving spaceships and visions of galactarian hegemony and machines the size of Manitoba busy about their business, psilocybin is good. Ayahuasca sort of contextualizes you in the cosmos. You feel yourself as a thing born and to die, and I don't know, it's very moving. It's also literally moving in the sense that it turns your guts inside out and reduces you to you recapture the primitive nematodal antecedent by just discovering the real power of your gastrointestinal tract.
What about MDMA, and is there like an organic substance? I suppose it's something organic, MDMA, or
I found that it was most interesting the first few times I did it, and then it sort of was a damped oscillation for me. But you know, the greatest, anybody who's marketing a drug who doesn't market it as a love drug just doesn't know anything about marketing. LSD was a love drug, marijuana has been a love drug, psilocybin, 2CB. What?
Crack is doing pretty well not being marketed that way.
I'm sure
No,
there
the
are
nickname for crack.
enclaves of
The
records.
nickname for crack on the street is love.
Is that right?
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
What can I say? And I think the truth is that all that a very large family of alkaloidal and psychoactive agents stimulate cause arousal, CNS stimulation, which in primates means erection and hanky-panky. So given that you've heard the hype and that the context supports the activity and that you're loaded, it would be no surprise if many people felt that Eros was well served by psychedelics.
My own feeling on this, and I don't have the extensive experience in ayahuasca. I've had an ayahuasca experience, but not the one that caused ego death. It was much more mild. It was very pleasant and very cleansing. But I have always associated psilocybin with being very heart-centered. And when I was younger and needed years of therapy that I later got, I had a very, very hard time. I could take acid endlessly because it's a very intellectual sort of mind experience. But I'd always had a very hard time with mushrooms because mushrooms were pushing, in a sense, on my emotional center.